Hey, thanks for joining me. This is The Last Hike. Today, let me tell you about three Karens who mistook confidence for preparation on one of America's most dangerous trails. The deeper they got into the hike, the harder it became to recognize that they were slowly losing the battle against the desert. And before the day was over, the heat would cook their bodies from the inside out. It was the 18th of July, 2017. On that morning, thousands of people would visit Angel's Landing, one of the most famous hikes in America. The trail isn't especially long, but it climbs steeply through a canyon of red and orange sandstone before reaching a narrow ridge high above the valley floor. Most days, hikers leave with tired legs, a few photos, and a story to tell. But this wasn't going to be one of those days. A powerful heat wave had settled over southern Utah, and by afternoon, temperatures were expected to climb well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Janice Norwood, Melissa Whitcomb, and Deanna Ellery had been friends for years and shared the kind of friendship that made traveling together feel easy. They weren't professional adventurers or hardcore hikers chasing records. They were ordinary people who enjoyed getting out, seeing new places, and collecting experiences along the way. Janice, 51, was usually the one who organized things. If a trip needed planning, reservations, or directions, she naturally stepped into that role. She liked having a plan and trusted her ability to make good decisions. Melissa, 43, was the most physically active of the group. She exercised regularly, took pride in staying fit, and rarely saw a challenge she didn't think she could handle. If there was a long walk, a steep climb, or a difficult workout, she was usually the first to volunteer. Deanna, 47, had a story for almost everything. A road trip through the mountains reminded her of another trip. A scenic overlook reminded her of somewhere she'd been years earlier. She loved traveling, and she often measured new experiences against old ones. As I learned more about their adventure, it became clear that Angel's Landing was the highlight of their summer road trip. The trip had started the way a lot of road trips do, with a list of places they wanted to see and far more ideas than time. Over the weeks leading up to their vacation, the three friends had gone back and forth on destinations. There were scenic drives, small towns, overlooks, and national parks scattered across the Southwest. The trail had a reputation that extended far beyond Utah. Even people who had never been there often recognized photos of the towering cliffs, the winding canyon below, and the narrow ridgeline leading toward the summit. It was one of those hikes people seemed to hear about everywhere. For Janice, it looked manageable with enough preparation and common sense. She spent time reading trail descriptions and checking maps, and by the time the trip arrived, she felt she had a pretty good understanding of what to expect. Melissa focused on the physical side of it. The distance didn't seem especially intimidating, and she felt confident she was in better shape than many of the people who would be attempting the hike. Deanna approached it differently. As she looked through photos and articles, she found herself comparing Angel's Landing to places she had already visited. The trail looked impressive, but nothing about it seemed completely outside of what she had experienced before. The forecast wasn't exactly a secret. Temperatures were expected to climb well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But summer heat in the Southwest wasn't unusual, and none of the women saw the forecast as a reason to change their plans. They packed water, hiking clothes, and the usual essentials, assuming a little extra caution would be enough. The day before the hike, the three friends arrived in southern Utah and got their first real look at the landscape they had spent weeks reading about. Photos had prepared them for the towering cliffs and narrow canyons, but seeing them in person was different. Everywhere they looked, massive walls of red and orange sandstone rose above the valley floor. Even the drive into the area felt like part of the experience. They spent part of the day exploring, taking pictures, and getting their bearings. The hike was scheduled for the following morning, giving them plenty of time to take in the scenery before the main event. The dry air felt noticeably different from what they were used to, and even standing in the afternoon sun for a few minutes could be uncomfortable. The heat was impossible to ignore. The forecast for the following day remained well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but nothing about the conditions seemed especially unusual. Visitors were everywhere, and trails throughout the area remained busy despite the temperature. The impression I was left with was that they considered the conditions normal for that time of year. The plan was simple: get some rest, start the hike the next morning, and finally see what all the excitement was about. The next morning started early. By the time Janice, Melissa, and Deanna arrived at the trailhead, plenty of other hikers were already moving in and out of the area. Some were adjusting backpacks, others were checking maps, and a few had clearly started their hikes long before sunrise. The atmosphere felt energetic. People were chatting, taking photos, and getting ready for what many considered the most famous hike in the park. The three friends took a few minutes to get organized before setting off. Janice glanced over the trail information one last time, while Melissa seemed eager to get moving after the early start. Deanna spent a few moments taking in the scenery around them. Warning signs reminded hikers about the dangers of heat, dehydration, and strenuous physical activity, especially during the summer months. Melissa said that if she listened to every warning sign on the trail, she'd never make it out of the parking lot. Even in the morning, the temperature was climbing quickly. The sun had already cleared the canyon walls, and there was little cloud cover to provide relief later in the day. Still, conditions seemed manageable. People were heading up the trail in a steady stream, and there was no obvious reason to believe the hike would be anything other than challenging and memorable. With their supplies packed and their route decided, the three women headed toward the trail and joined the growing line of hikers making their way into the canyon. The first stretch of the hike got off to a good start. The trail was busy but not crowded, and the morning air was still comfortable despite the forecast for later in the day. The path wound through the canyon as towering sandstone walls rose around them, creating the kind of scenery that made people stop every few minutes just to look around. The pace was relaxed, conversation came easily, and there was no shortage of things to talk about.
Like many first-time visitors, the three friends frequently paused to admire the views or point out features in the landscape that looked even more impressive in person than they had in photographs.
The climb required effort, but nothing felt unusual. The trail was unfolding much the way Janice had expected from the maps and descriptions she had studied beforehand. Melissa appeared completely comfortable with the physical demands of the hike and rarely seemed out of breath. Diana found herself comparing the scenery to places she had visited on previous trips, though she admitted there was something different about the sheer scale of the canyon around them. The weather remained clear, the trail conditions were good, and the destination they had been looking forward to for weeks felt a little closer with every step. As the morning went on, the trail gradually became more demanding. The elevation gain was steady enough that nobody really noticed it at first, but after a while, the climb started making itself known. Conversations became a little more spread out, and the pauses between them lasted a bit longer, not because anyone was struggling, but because more attention was being spent on the trail itself. The crowds also began to thin out. Some hikers moved ahead at a faster pace, while others stopped frequently to rest or take photographs. Janice, Melissa, and Diana settled into a rhythm that worked for them. They weren't rushing, but they weren't lingering for long either. Whenever they stopped, Melissa was usually the first one ready to start moving again. The higher they climbed, the wider the views became. Sections of the canyon that had looked enormous from below now seemed surprisingly distant. Looking back down the trail,
I could tell it was the kind of progress that felt satisfying, because you could actually see how far they'd come.
By now, the morning air was beginning to lose some of its coolness. The sun felt stronger than it had an hour earlier, and shaded areas became a little more noticeable whenever the trail passed through them. Nobody paid much attention to that yet. Their focus remained on the climb ahead and the views surrounding them.
I could see that the climb was getting harder, but at that point, the scenery was more than making up for it.
By mid-morning, roughly 2 hours into the hike, the trail had started revealing a different side of itself. The scenery was still impressive, but the conditions were becoming harder to ignore. Long stretches of the route offered little protection from the sun, and some sections felt noticeably warmer than others. The canyon walls no longer blocked as much sunlight as they had earlier in the morning, leaving more of the trail exposed. The women weren't the only ones noticing it. Hikers coming back down often looked far more tired than those still heading up. Many were carrying empty or nearly empty water bottles, and quite a few stopped whenever they found a patch of shade. Some rested for only a few minutes before continuing. Others seemed reluctant to leave the cooler spots at all. When a younger group mentioned turning around because of the heat, Janice commented that she would have expected people their age to handle the conditions a little better. Along the trail, reminders about heat and hydration appeared more than once.
The message was simple. Summer conditions could become dangerous faster than many people expected, because in the dry desert air, it wasn't always easy to tell how much water your body was losing.
During one of their brief stops, all three women lingered in the shade a little longer than they had earlier that morning. For now, however, the hike continued much as it had before. The trail remained busy, the views remained spectacular, and the summit still felt well within reach. By this point, the hike was demanding more from them than it had earlier in the morning. Nothing dramatic had happened, and nobody felt particularly concerned, but the effort was beginning to add up. The combination of climbing, direct sunlight, and steadily rising temperatures was turning what had started as a comfortable walk into something that required a little more attention. Water was disappearing faster than any of them had expected. Each time they stopped, bottles came out almost automatically. A quick drink became part of every break. What surprised them wasn't how thirsty they felt, but how often they felt it. Even after drinking, the relief didn't seem to last very long. None of them viewed that as a warning sign.
It's as if it felt like a normal response to a hot hike to them, at least from what I could tell.
The dry desert air made it easy to overlook just how much fluid they were losing. The heat seemed to pull moisture away gradually, one sip of water at a time. The trail remained busy, though the mood felt slightly different now. More hikers were resting when they found shade. Water bottles appeared in almost every hand. Conversations that had been lively earlier in the morning were becoming quieter. Nobody was treating the conditions like an emergency, but there were growing signs that people were starting to respect the heat a little more than they had at the beginning of the day. As they continued climbing, the trail itself began demanding more attention. Earlier sections had felt relatively forgiving, but now there were fewer places to comfortably stop and recover. More of the route sat fully exposed to the sun, with the surrounding sandstone reflecting heat back onto the trail. The physical effort wasn't dramatically different from before, but it felt more constant. The women found themselves focusing less on the scenery and more on the next stretch of trail ahead. Breaks became slightly more practical than leisurely.
Instead of stopping to simply admire the landscape, they were increasingly using those pauses to catch their breath, drink some water, and give their legs a chance to recover.
Melissa still seemed eager to maintain momentum whenever the group stopped, though even she was spending a little more time resting than she had earlier in the morning. Janice occasionally checked their progress against what she remembered from the trail information she had read beforehand. Deanna continued pointing out similarities to other places she had visited, but those observations were becoming less frequent as the climb required more of her attention. They had already covered a significant portion of the hike by this point, but getting farther now required more effort than any of them had expected. Shortly before noon, the three friends found a place to stop for a longer break. By then, they had been hiking for several hours, and the opportunity to sit down for a few minutes was welcome. Water bottles were passed around, snacks came out, and for the first time that day, there was no immediate rush to continue moving. The stop indeed seemed to help. After spending a few minutes off their feet, everyone appeared noticeably more comfortable than they had while climbing. Breathing slowed, legs recovered, and the fatigue that had been building throughout the morning no longer seemed quite as obvious. Around them, other hikers were doing much the same thing, taking advantage of any chance to rest before continuing farther up the trail. For Janice, the break reinforced the idea that they were managing the hike well. Melissa looked refreshed after sitting down for a while, and Diana appeared far more interested in the scenery again than she had been during the previous stretch of climbing.
At that point, I don't think they saw the discomfort as anything more than a temporary issue.
When they eventually stood up and continued hiking, there was little to suggest that the rest of the day would be any different.
If anything, I got the sense that the break left them more confident than they had been when they first sat down.
The longer the hike went on, the more each of the women started interpreting the conditions in her own way. Nobody was arguing, and there was no dramatic conflict within the group, but they weren't necessarily seeing the trail through the same lens anymore. Janice remained focused on the overall progress they were making. To her, they were still moving at a reasonable pace and covering ground steadily. The hike was certainly more demanding than it had been earlier in the morning, but nothing about it struck her as unusual.
To someone like me looking in from the outside, Janice appeared unfazed by the added difficulty.
Melissa viewed things differently. Her attention stayed fixed on the physical challenge itself. When another hiker mentioned slowing down because of the heat, Melissa responded by saying that most people quit long before they actually reached their limits. The climb had become tiring, but she treated that as something to work through rather than something to worry about. Diana continued drawing comparisons to previous trips. If another hiker mentioned difficult conditions, Diana usually had a story about a trip she considered even tougher. Some hikes had been steeper, others had been longer. A few had taken place in conditions she remembered as being just as uncomfortable.
Her thinking back on those experiences, it made me realize that the challenges of the day probably felt familiar to her rather than concerning.
None of these viewpoints seemed unreasonable on their own. If anything, they helped explain why the three friends remained confident. Each woman had her own explanation for why the hike still felt manageable, and together, those explanations made it easier to keep moving forward. As noon approached, the character of the hike began changing again. The sun was now high overhead, and much of the trail sat fully exposed beneath it. Areas that had seemed merely warm earlier in the morning now felt noticeably hotter. The canyon still looked spectacular, but fewer people were stopping simply to admire the view. Looking back over the course of the morning, the difference was obvious. Rest stops were lasting a little longer, water breaks were becoming more frequent, conversations that had once filled much of the hike now appeared only in shorter bursts between stretches of walking. The three friends were experiencing the same changes. Janice spent less time talking about the route and more time focusing on the trail immediately ahead. Melissa was still maintaining a steady pace, but the effortless energy she had shown earlier was beginning to fade. Deanna had become quieter as well, saving most of her comments for moments when the group stopped to rest. Around them, other hikers seemed to be adjusting in similar ways. More people were seeking out whatever cover they could find. Small patches of shade that might have gone unnoticed earlier in the day were now occupied almost immediately whenever they appeared. Nobody seemed alarmed, but there was a growing sense that the conditions deserved more respect than they had that morning. By this point, they were much closer to their destination than they were to the trailhead. They had already invested hours into the climb and covered a significant portion of the route. Turning around remained an option, but it was no longer the option most people naturally thought about first. The afternoon heat had now settled in completely. Whatever relief the morning had offered was gone. The trail, the surrounding rock, and the air itself all seemed to radiate warmth. Even when the group stopped moving, there was little sense of cooling off. Rest breaks still helped, but the effects didn't seem to last as long as they had earlier in the day. Hours of climbing were beginning to make themselves known. Standing up after a break took a little more effort than before. Legs felt heavier. Recovery came more slowly. None of those things seemed unusual on their own, but together, they were changing the pace of the hike. The destination remained important, but more attention was being spent on the next section of trail than on the summit itself. Janice continued checking their progress whenever she could. Melissa still pushed herself to keep a steady pace, even if it required more effort than it had that morning. Deanna found herself taking longer to settle back into a rhythm after each stop, though she mostly kept those frustrations to herself. Around them, the mood on the trail had changed noticeably from the energy of the morning. Conversations were shorter. Hikers spent more time watching their footing and less time admiring the scenery. Nobody appeared panicked or alarmed, but there was a growing sense that the day was becoming more demanding than many people had expected. At some point during a long hike, the destination starts feeling closer than the starting point, even when that's not technically true. Janice, Melissa, and Deanna had already spent hours on the trail and covered a significant amount of ground.
The way I saw it, they had already committed so much energy and time to the climb that continuing forward just felt easier than giving up.
The heat had become a constant presence. Water breaks still happened regularly, but the relief never seemed to last for very long. Within minutes of starting again, the warmth and fatigue would return. Janice saw no reason to abandon the plan now. Melissa treated the growing discomfort as something to push through. Deanna reminded herself that difficult stretches were part of almost every memorable trip she had ever taken. To anyone passing by, the three women would have looked like countless other hikers spending a hot day on a demanding trail. Tired, certainly. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but not yet in obvious trouble. The effects of the day were becoming harder to hide. Janice was the first to show signs that something was changing. She seemed slightly more distracted than usual and occasionally needed a moment to reorient herself when checking the route ahead. It wasn't enough to alarm anyone, and she largely brushed it off as fatigue from several hours of hiking. Melissa was dealing with her own problems. The steady pace she had maintained throughout most of the day was becoming harder to sustain. Her legs felt heavier, and occasional muscle tightness appeared whenever the group stopped and started again. She continued pushing forward, treating it as part of the challenge. Deanna had grown noticeably quieter. The stories and comparisons to previous trips had mostly stopped, replaced by a growing focus on simply keeping pace with the group. She found herself lingering a little longer during breaks before getting back on her feet. Still, none of the three women considered turning around. The trail was demanding nearly all of their attention now. Long stretches passed without much conversation as the three women focused on the climb. Rest stops were becoming more frequent, and getting back on their feet no longer felt automatic. Janice seemed unusually distracted, occasionally pausing as if she had lost her train of thought. Melissa continued pushing herself forward, but the breaks between stops were growing shorter. Deanna spent longer sitting during rests, and appeared far less interested in the scenery than she had been earlier in the day. Other hikers were beginning to notice. A few glanced over as the group stopped again, while others lingered nearby before continuing on. The three women no longer blended into the crowd the way they had that morning. The next time the group stopped, it became clear that Janice was struggling. She appeared confused and had difficulty focusing on simple tasks that would normally have required little thought. Nearby hikers began paying closer attention as she took longer than expected to gather herself and get moving again. When the group eventually continued, Janice's condition worsened. She seemed unsteady on her feet and noticeably less aware of her surroundings. After only a short distance, she stumbled, lost her balance, and collapsed on the trail. The situation changed immediately. Hikers nearby moved in to help while someone placed an emergency call. As attention turned toward Janice, it became clear that Melissa and Diana were having problems of their own. Melissa was struggling to remain on her feet after stops, while Diana appeared increasingly weak and spent more time sitting than standing. What had started as concern for a single hiker quickly became a medical emergency involving all three women.
With little shade available and temperatures still above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the group remained exposed while waiting for help to arrive.
The emergency call brought help into motion, but reaching the group was never going to be quick. The trail's terrain, the afternoon heat, and the location of the hikers all created delays. While assistance made its way toward them, nearby hikers continued doing what they could to help and monitor the three women. Janice remained in critical condition. Melissa and Deanna were also struggling as the effects of hours spent in extreme heat continued to overwhelm their bodies. The wait felt long, and the conditions that had contributed to the emergency were still present around them. By the time help reached the scene, the situation had become extremely difficult to reverse. Despite extensive efforts to save them, Janice Norwood, Melissa Whitcomb, and Diana Ellery all died from heat-related medical emergencies brought on by prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures and dehydration. Investigators pieced together the timeline using phone records, time-stamped photographs, witness accounts, and location data recovered from the group's devices. Those records showed that the three women had spent hours hiking in extreme heat as temperatures climbed well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They also revealed a gradual slowdown in pace as the day progressed, matching the accounts provided by hikers who encountered them on the trail. The findings identified heat-related illness as the primary factor in all three deaths. Janice suffered severe heat stroke after prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures. Melissa died from exertional heat stroke after continuing to hike as conditions worsened. Deanna experienced a heat-related medical emergency complicated by dehydration and pre-existing cardiovascular risk factors. The outcome was ultimately linked to a combination of extreme heat, prolonged exposure, physical exertion, and the decision to continue despite worsening conditions.
What struck me most was that their hike ended as a reminder that in the desert, even ordinary decisions can carry serious consequences when temperatures push beyond what the human body can safely handle.